You're listening to Indications by the Conference Board.
Hello, welcome to Indications. I'm Gad Lebanon, head of the Labor Market Institute at the Conference Board. This is our third and final episode in our podcast series based on our report, U.S. Labor Shortages, Challenges and Solutions, which you can find on our website. Today we'll discuss company solutions to the labor shortages problem. Joining me today is Elizabeth Crofoot, a senior economist at the Conference Board. Most recently, Elizabeth's research has focused on U.S. labor shortages and uncovering what companies are doing to combat these challenges. I'm also joined by Frank Steemers, associate economist at the Conference Board. Frank is one of our primary research focusing on U.S. and global labor markets and has developed several of our online data sets assessing labor shortages. Elizabeth and Frank, thank you for being with us today.
Happy to be here, Gad.
Thanks, Gad.
So, in an earlier podcast, you heard about why we are having labor shortages problems, and we focused in the second podcast on the impact of the trends in wages. Today we're going to focus on solutions, on what companies are doing besides raising wages. What are they doing to combat labor shortages? And when we think about solutions, we can think about it from the macro level. So, for example, if we have more immigration, we have more available workers, then we'll have a smaller labor shortages problem. If we can somehow get more people to participate in the labor market, we also reduce the labor shortages problem. And there's a lot that the government can do to raise labor force participation. But we're mostly going to focus on the micro level or the company level, what solutions are companies are taking on. So that could mean raising productivity or doing more automation. If you do more automation, then you need fewer workers, and that reduces the labor shortages problem. And there are also a lot of retention and recruiting solutions that companies are doing in order to ease the labor shortages problem. And since most executives, that the last time we had a significant labor shortages problem was in the late 90s, early 2000. So for most executives, they never really operated in a period of such a tight labor market for such a prolonged period of time. So it's not obvious what one should do in such an environment. So we decided to find out more about it. And what companies are doing to solve their hiring and retention problems. And we did it through the Conference Board Labor Shortages Solution Survey. So Elizabeth, you are the principal person doing this survey and analyzing it. So can you tell us a little about that?
Sure. We conducted our survey during the spring and summer of 2019, and our goal was really to find out what companies are actually doing to solve these recruitment and retention problems brought about by labor shortages. So we had 225 respondents, mostly HR practitioners, and primarily in the talent acquisition space. And we asked them, what actions has your company taken to specifically address recruitment and retention difficulties? And our respondents selected from a set of 59 solutions to recruitment and retention problems. And when we were analyzing the results, we divided our survey respondents into those that were more impacted by labor shortages and those that were less impacted. And through the survey, respondents had the opportunity to identify the adverse business outcomes that their company had experienced as a result of labor shortages. And this is how we separated them. So those companies that had mentioned that they experienced 5 or more adverse business outcomes were the ones that we indicated as or defined as more impacted by labor shortages, and those companies that indicated that they had suffered from less than 5 adverse business outcomes were those that we deemed as less impacted by labor shortages. So that's sort of our framework for analyzing these data.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So what are the main takeaways in terms of, let's start with recruitment solutions?
Well, overall, you mentioned increasing wages and salaries, and that was our number one solution across the board. About 75% of our respondents said that they were actually increasing their compensation in order to attract more talent. But what we found is that this isn't enough. Employers have to do more than just raise wages and salaries. And one primary example of this is that it's really the blue-collar employers that we identified as being primarily most impacted by labor shortages, and they're the ones that are selecting 15 and 20 different types of strategies that they've tried in addition to raising wages and salaries. So some of these include, for example, tactical recruitment solutions. So these are the low-hanging fruit that companies can implement relatively easily. So talent acquisition teams, for example, can enhance their referral programs or increase social media efforts. These are items that they can do relatively independently without a lot of buy-in from other parts of the organization. They can do it relatively lower cost. And for example, we have examples of companies that have attributed 30, 40, and 50% of their recruitment to their referral programs. And the same thing with social media efforts. It's primarily something that companies have been doing to attract their blue-collar workforce. And in addition, they've also been using staffing firms it's one of the most popular strategies for, again, using among blue-collar employers as well. Another strategy is that companies have been reevaluating job requirements and relaxing hiring criteria. So what hiring managers are now doing is they're really reworking those job descriptions based on the core competencies that are needed to perform the job. So those core skill sets. So instead of focusing on nice-to-haves, hiring managers are now really focusing on those must-have skill sets. So in order to do that, they're lowering some experience requirements, they're lowering skill requirements, and really reworking those job descriptions around this new, reality of what the labor market is offering.
Right. So, Elizabeth, if they're lowering their requirements and they end up hiring less qualified workers, don't they need to also train them?
Yes, that's exactly what companies are doing. But instead of forming this as lowering standards, what companies are doing is just focusing on attracting or hiring candidates that are trainable with core skill sets and that have technical aptitude and other foundational skills. So they're now ramping up their internal training programs, they're developing talent pipelines, and especially among blue-collar employers, they're developing integrated work programs with colleges, high schools, and trade schools, and really focusing on gaining new talent through internships and apprenticeships, so cultivating those relationships within the community.
Right. So far, Elizabeth, you talked mostly about recruitment. Are companies also doing something about retention?
Yes, that's one major component in terms of trying to retain the talent that companies need. And companies are making their workplace a more attractive place for their employees. For example, by offering flexible work schedules, floating start times, for example, half shifts, shift swapping. And this is something that not only white-collar employers are doing, but increasingly blue-collar employees, even in a manufacturing production environment where there is a very specific sequence of events on the production line. Companies are finding that in offering additional flexibility, they're actually seeing increased engagement, increased productivity, and a reduction in employee absenteeism. So it's having more effects than just, retaining workers. And they're also, especially among white-collar employers, they're offering more remote work opportunities as well.
What about things that are kind of like things like stay interviews?
Yes, and there are tactical retention solutions as well that companies can implement. So one thing is what you said, conducting stay interviews to try to identify those factors that will make employees stay for longer, especially if they're showing signs of wanting to abandon ship, and also making managers more accountable for retention. So actually the trucking industry has been key in this regard because they're seeing almost 90 to 95% turnover rates. So there's examples of trucking companies that have made their managers accountable for keeping their drivers and monitoring their meetings and overseeing how they're actually managing their drivers. So those are a couple of other examples there as well.
Right. Elizabeth, if we go back to recruitment for a second, we did ask also about the strategy of expanding recruitment to underrepresented demographics. What did we find there?
So companies are really trying to reach out to these underrepresented communities. For example, women, minorities, mature workers, veterans, immigrants, and persons with disabilities. And they're doing that by offering special training programs, offering work accommodations, and even changing certain job characteristics to make the workplace more inclusive for these groups. And again, using the trucking industry as an example, some trucking companies are now offering female-friendly packages with automatic transmissions in their trucks. They're offering women hotel stays instead of having them stay in a truck stop somewhere that might not be as safe for a woman that's traveling alone. And they're also adjusting their routes so that women can, instead of being gone for 2 or 3 weeks, they're now on the road for 2 or 3 days and they can come back home to fulfill their family obligations. So it's those types of efforts that employers can make to really accommodate these other underrepresented groups.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Frank, turning to you, related to this strategy of expanding recruitment to underrepresented demographics, we're actually seeing that in the data about employment, right?
Right, correct. So after this survey, we were, of course, also interested to see, do we see these trends also on a macro level? So looking at population shares for demographic groups, employment, labor force participation rate. So what we see already on a national level is that more people are joining the labor force because wages are rising. They have higher chances of finding a job. And this is, of course, also related to companies expanding their recruitment efforts. So interestingly, we find that especially among, as we call it, underrepresented demographic groups, employment shares or employment growth is really growing fast. So, for example, we see that for black workers, there are more of them, many more of them are now employed. And we see that across all occupations, but especially in blue-collar occupations. And also outpacing their growth in the population. So really showing it is not just the normal demographic trends that we have a youth population that is with higher shares of African Americans. It's really their share in employment that is growing fast. Similarly, we also see that for Hispanic workers and then especially for young Hispanic women. There we see that especially their share in employment has been really growing fast. Other groups we see, for example, that more older workers, so those aged 55 and above, are also in employment. Here we did find that in our survey that this may not be related to a specific strategy of companies, because no company actually picked a strategy. We want to solve our labor shortages problem by hiring more mature workers. And besides that, I would just say that the overall U.S. population or the U.S. labor force is getting more diverse. And the last group where we see an interesting trend is actually that more women are now working in blue-collar occupations, and especially transportation.
Interesting. And you mentioned the result about retaining older workers, and that actually, I think, from all the 59 strategies that we offered our respondents to choose from, that was the one that was chosen the least. So it's clearly not a very popular strategy that employers are choosing. What about automation? We mentioned it earlier. What role does it already play, or should or will play in reducing labor shortages?
Right. Of course, now when wages are rising, companies cannot find workers, so they will, of course, try to automate jobs, and of course, this would be a great solution. When we look at labor productivity growth rates, so that is what we look at to see if there has been any improvements or companies becoming more productive because of automation, we see maybe some increasing trends now. Companies that feel more pressure because labor costs are rising. So that could be a solution. We see, for example, when we look especially at office and administration jobs, there we see that for some of these jobs, either employment is only growing slowly or already declining. So that could be an indication that automation is already happening. Overall, though, I would stress that compared to previous decades, labor productivity growth has been very slow. And we hear, of course, a lot of people talk about robots maybe going to take over, but maybe our audience, but also business leaders should more think about how are we going to deal with the current labor shortage, because it doesn't seem to be the case that tomorrow, maybe not even the next 10 years, automation can simply solve that.
Right. And that, I think, is indeed a key question, whether labor shortages are just a kind of a phase that will pass soon, or is this something that will stay with us for a longer time? And I think productivity growth is probably the main potential game changer. Without productivity growth, I think it would be very difficult to reduce labor shortages, because from a demographic perspective, the situation will only get worse between now and 2030. The retirement of the baby boomers will continue for sure. Our projections actually show that the shrinkage in the number of people in the working age population without a BA is going to accelerate. So from that perspective, it will be even more difficult to deal with labor shortages. We actually, beyond just the impact of labor shortages, if we look at the impact on growth of the U.S. economy as a whole, kind of the very weak supply of labor is having a very strong impact. We actually think that it would be a miracle if we are able to maintain our historical growth in standard of living in such a labor supply environment. And again, the main game changer it could be productivity growth and more automation, but if anything, the last decade is not signaling a breakthrough in that regard. I know it is a bit of a gloomy finish to our indication podcast, but I should mention, as we mentioned in one of the earlier podcasts, that as difficult as it is for businesses, from the workers' perspective, having a labor shortages is a good thing, and we're seeing very positive impact on wage growth, on job satisfaction, on wage inequality, on participation of minorities in the labor force, on poverty rates, on education. We're seeing a lot of positive impact of the strong labor market. So we will wrap it up on that note. Thank you, Elizabeth and Frank. It's been an insightful discussion about what companies are doing or could be doing to address labor shortages. And thank you to all of our listeners for joining us for this podcast series around U.S. labor markets and labor shortages. If you haven't already, tune in to our previous 2 episodes. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to Indications. You can find this program and several others from the Conference Board on our website by searching the word podcasts, or you can find them on your favorite podcast app. Thanks again for listening. I'm Gad Lebanon with the Conference Board.
This has been Indications from the Conference Board.